afternoon, everyone. I'm waiting for the microphone to come back on for me. I'm going to go back over to the microphone. So, shameless plug to start with. We will be having a charity ball and dinner sponsored by the Institute for Cultural Unity, as well as the Student Activities Board and the Center for Student Involvement on Friday, December 6th. As it says, the dinner is from 6 to 8 in the nightclub, with a dance to follow from 8 to 11. Tickets for both events combined are $15, $5 for the dance, $10 for the dinner. We are strongly reaching out to all of our colleagues and students, and especially some of our offices, to potentially consider sponsoring seats and tables for students, for yourselves, and for others. So again, shameless plug. So again, thank you. Again, I'd like to thank the organizing committee and my fellow speakers for their contributions, and everyone else for making these opportunities even possible. With that, I'd like to start with my talk today, The Color of Caring, talking about Black children and adoption. I'd like to begin with a disclaimer to say that I'm not going to be able to, only going to be able to speak today on one particular type of true transracial adoption, that being domestic adoption of a child of two Black parents into a family with two white parents. I'm not going to be able to speak in any great detail about either international adoption or biracial adoption and the processes and such that go into that. I've spent a great portion of my early career working in international and domestic adoption, as well as racial and ethnic identity development. I was the project coordinator for at the time, the fourth largest adoption study in the country and sixth largest in the world, the Northeast-Northwest Collaborative Adoption Project, during my time at Penn State, in addition to some of my own published work and research in some of those areas. So I really want to be as clear as possible to sort of talk about policy, the ways in which the controversy surrounding the adoption of Black children into white families in the U.S. has come from both proponents, as well as both Black and white, as well as individuals whom are for racial integration, but also those opponents in favor of policies amounting to little more than racial and cultural preservation. I want to make it as clear as possible that it's not my intention to categorically endorse or refute the claims of either side, but rather to provide you with some explanation of the underlying reality and allow for you to come to your own sort of exploration of the nuances that go along with the debate at your leisure, and then ultimately for you to be able to make a decision for yourself as to where you fall. The perspectives in that are provided, there is some empirical evidence that underlies this, but also those particular perspectives of those of you who may be adoptees, who may be social workers, who may be in the field in some ways, may not mirror some of these things. And again, I do recognize that that's sort of the reality, but the broader sort of sense is what I kind of want to give you a perspective of and on today. So some of you, again, might even ask, why is it that how am I qualified to be able to give this particular talk, to talk about this? Well, 42 and a half years ago, my parents adopted me. They used this specific picture to select me out of the picture book here in New York, from the state of New York. My birth mother was a white German backgrounded teenager. My father was not a white individual. I do not know what the racial background of my birth father was. I still to this day do not, and through Governor Cuomo Sr., Mario, there are options out there for me to be able to put my information into the system in the state, and if my birth mother and my birth family, if any members of my birth family actually were to put their information in, we probably could connect. I have not finished that. My adoptive mother gave me the forms and things like that. I filled them out. I just never got them notarized. So I'm a little bit of a slacker in some of these things. But again, it gives me an opportunity. So you might say in some ways that I have a particular familiarity in some ways in addition to my research, in addition to some of the things that I've done. Additionally, again, saying that I am myself a biracial adoptee. The family to which I was adopted in, and my family, for all intents and purposes, was also biracial. My adoptive mother lives in Chittenango, is white, and my father passed away when I was 21, is of American Indian, African American, and Canadian descent. So, as we sort of look like and think about some of these things that go on, it seems like sort of the place to begin to talk about transracial adoption, which is really what this is to start really, unfortunately, about talking about international adoption. After World War II, and more so after the Korean conflict, there were a number of orphans in Southeast Asia and also in Europe at the time that were fathered by many of them fathered by American soldiers and American servicemen. In order for these children to be brought back into the country, they needed to have at least one sponsoring parent, and in some cases even the left behind parent, in some cases if they were not in fact orphaned, to sponsor them to come into the country. It was actually legal to be able to do this. This was more of a philanthropic sort of reach. So you saw pieces of literature, you saw popular magazines of the day, you saw Reader's Digest sort of talk about and sort of put out the idea of how important it was for Americans to take care of these orphan children. In fact, some cases putting them out into a situation where, there are these half American, half Asian waifs, just dying in spaces and not having to love and collection and all the connections that you could possibly have in America. And this was a reach out. Henry and Bertha Holt of Oregon began their own adoption agency, the Holt Adoption Agency, which is the largest adoption agency in the world that deals specifically with Chinese and Korean children. The only issue was that, especially after World War II, and especially if you look at it domestically, these adoptions ran afoul of what almost to this day has continued to be the policy of matching or selective placement, placing children specifically with families that match either their ethnic, racial, or cultural backgrounds. So there was something to be said for those families that were actually adopting these children. Now, the interesting thing is that in 1948, the first legal and recorded transracial adoption, not transcultural, but transracial, that is two parents whom are not of the racial and ethnic background of the child, were actually allowed in the state of Minnesota. In that particular case, those two white individuals, evangelicals actually at the time, were adopted a Native American or First Nation child. Minnesota was rather liberal in their interpretations. There weren't the laws that are in place now for the Native American and First Nation protections, the intertribal pacts and such that occur now that, again, actually are working against actually these types of adoptions at this point as a first step. But again, this was the first time in the United States that we had legalized transracial adoption. It wasn't until 1972 that the last laws actually outlawing transracial adoption were abolished in Texas and Louisiana. What's interesting in this particular point is that international adoption, transcultural adoption, was legal in most states in 1956. Interracial marriage was legalized in 1967. So you could be interracially married, but you could not adopt transracially until 1972 in all states of the country. And again, the number of states that came along, especially in 1956, to allow for transracial adoption sort of paved a way and paved an opportunity for us to be able to take some of these steps. So as I said, up to that point in history, the purposes behind matching or selective placement for foster and adoptive children was to help ease the adjustment of the child. Now, I'll talk about some of the current policies like the Multi-Ethnic Placement Act and the Interethnic Amendments of 1994 and 96, which up to now have prohibited the use of race as a significant determinant for placement of a child, ultimately based upon the societal beliefs of best interests and or agency or experiential best practice. At a number of both policy and practice points, we have seen that international adoptions actually paved the way for a conversation about transracial adoption. It allowed for greater acceptance of domestic transracial adoptions in the 60s and 70s, so you did see laws in 37 states actually change from the illegality of transracial adoption to allowing for some form of transracial adoption. Most often they were talking about, at that point, Negro children into white families. But still we were running into issues. We also saw family formation across racial lines becoming a conspicuous social issue for the first time in a very, very long time. But the one thing that it has done and is continued to push, and we see even today, is that international adoptions have allowed us to have a conversation about what is racial and cultural sensitivity. We talk about it today as cultural competence. We talk about those particular things. What allows a family to be able to adopt? What criteria should a family fit into, regardless of their particular race, if they're trying to adopt interracially? Interculturally, there aren't as many hoops, if you will, legally to jump through. There are still a number of hoops to jump through, but it's a lot harder to adopt transracially, nationally, than it is to actually adopt interculturally. And some of that is due to governmental oversight in some of the policies that I will sort of bring to the forefront and sort of talk about in the next few slides. Now, in 1972, as an opening salvo, because again, those last two laws being passed in Texas and Louisiana, the National Association for Black Social Workers, at time, the preeminent group that could speak eloquently, that could speak policy-wise, that was placing policy up to the front, came out with their own statement. So I give you that statement. I realize that a number of my slides are very word-heavy, but I'm sorry. But what I can say in this particular case, in this particular space, is that even more recently, in 1996, 1994, 2006, 2008, the leadership of the National Association for Black Social Workers has not softened their stance from this statement in 1972. They continue to liken, in fact, they continue to liken transracial adoption to cultural genocide. Tony Oliver, former chairman of the organization, stated that same race makes sense because it's what the child is accustomed to, what causes the least disruption in the child's life. Often when people are looking at love is all it takes, they seem to overlook the impact a race has on our society. Somehow when it's a case of adoption, race suddenly doesn't seem to matter anymore. These statements and all of them that followed up to the most recent statement in 2008 by the Evan B. Donaldson Foundation and Institute, what is seen as the preeminent adoptive research and practice organization in the US, supports the reinstatement of race as a considerable factor, something that, as we'll talk about with the multi-ethnic placement and interethnic placement amendments, something that's prohibited in those cases, that placement decisions need to be based on more than just merely race. Even as we look at this, I want to start to show you some numbers. As we look at the figures that ultimately underlie racial and transracial adoption, these numbers have not changed a lot. And I know that it says 1987, but I re-looked at these numbers again today and looked at them for 2015 and 2016, and I'll talk about the small changes that are there. In 1987, it said that only 8% of all state and private agency adoptions include parents and children of different races. So if you take that additional breakdown, what you saw in 1987 is that 1% of white women adopted black children, 5% of white women adopted children of other races, which, based upon the way that the census was set up in the 1980s up until 1990, your options were white, Asian, Native American. So that's why this statement says 5% of white women adopt children of other race. The only other option other than black was Asian. And this was recorded through a number of other policy groups in that within the country up until the mid-1990s. We can look at it and see it in labor. We can see it in a variety of other places. We see that 2% of women of other races, again, being black and Asian, adopt white children. But those estimates include foreign-born children. So even in talking about this as transracial, there's a commingling of the idea of transracial and transcultural and intercultural adoption. So it becomes an issue within the United States that we're starting to mix numbers. As you see at the bottom, that estimate of 15% of adoptions coming out of the foster care and adoptive system actually accounting to be transracial holds today. The number for 2018, which we'll talk about, is actually only 18% of all adoptions that are actually done are actually transracial. That is where, again, the child is of one race with both of their parents being of one race, and the parents that they're adopting, the family that they are adopting into is both parents are of the same race. Otherwise, we're talking about biracial adoption. We're talking about inter- and intraracial adoption. So that's why I try to be very clear when I say this, when I talk about interracial adoption. Intraracial adoption would be two black parents adopting a black child of two black parents, or two white parents adopting two of a white. All pieces are exactly, and all ethnic backgrounds are exactly the same. So I try not to mix and say inter and intra and things of that sort. So again, the Department of Health and Human Services in 2000, the last time that we actually had national level statistics and numbers that gave both private and state level adoptive and foster care information. I want you to think about that. 2000. We're in 2019. The federal government has stopped counting state and private adoptions. Right now, the numbers that I'll give you off of the adoptive and foster care reporting system only talk about state adoptions. There will be no private adoption agencies involved in this because they're not getting federal funding. I say that because that's going to come up in a little bit. I want you to have that sort of in the back of your mind. So again, in the last year that records were easily available, 1998, which was the report in 2000, there were 500,000 foster kids in the entire system. So 500,000 children in the system, regardless of their particular stance, whether they were runaways, whether they were in institutions, that's everyone that was in the foster care and the protective system within the country. So you look at every state system, all the numbers that you have. You had 559,000 foster kids. 240,166 were black and were identified specifically as black. These are not two or more race. These are specifically their singular identity was as black. 125,000 of those children were available to be adopted. What I mean by available to be adopted is that the parental rights had been forfeited, that they had gone through the court process where they were placed in the foster care system or the adoptive system, and they were eligible to be adopted by any family that came along and met the criteria for adoption. So 25% of those whom were registered in the entire system were eligible for adoption. 114,148 had an action plan that specifically was indicating for adoption, that the plan for these children was not reunification with family, was not into institution, was not into some other form of care, but was specifically for adoption. 65,944 of those children were black and were waiting to be adopted. So of the 125,000, 65,000, almost 66,000 of them were black children waiting to be adopted. $37,000 of those children, of that 125, were actually adopted. So about 40% of those whom were available and eligible to be adopted were adopted. 15,000, almost 16,000 of the black children in the foster care system were adopted, which comes to 43% of the eligible children, or 24% of the eligible black children were adopted. Now, where this falls apart is we have to think that it's 15, we know that 15% of those children were adopted transracially. Some of them went back into their adoptive families. Some of them were just released because they do talk about, and the federal government does talk about the way that they commingle and say, well, we have a child that was eligible for adoption. The adoption worked, but then it was recalled. Whether the child ran away, it broke, there was some level of disruption. It was still counted as an adoption. And in 1998, again, with some of the policies that were there, we were running into issues. We were thinking about, what are we trying to do? How are we trying to take these steps forward? So again, these numbers coming from the US Census and specifically the Child Welfare Services website gives us something to sort of think about. Now that is 1998. Fast forward 20 years to 2018, the last set that's actually available. 437,282 foster kids, 99,000 black children, 125, roughly again, that were available for adoption, again about 25%, but 28% of those registered. 116,000 black children had action plans indicating adoption, with 27,000 of them being black children waiting to be adopted. About 47% of all of the 125,000 children were available to be adopted were actually adopted. 10,795 children in the foster care system were adopted, which again comes to 17% of all of the eligible children and 39% of the black children. But again, only 15 to 18% of those children were adopted transracially. I say all these things and give you these numbers, and I realize this is a lot of numbers to throw at y'all. I realize that. But there's a reason why I throw these numbers at you. I want you to see the percentages. I want you to think about the percentages, and then to take some of the smaller sorts of pieces that sort of go along with that. Because the adoption and foster care analysis and reporting system, the federal government's state-mandated system, every state system has to report how many children came in and out of their system. This does not include the international, this doesn't include the numbers for private adoption agencies, for Catholic charities, Jewish charities, Lutheran charities, any of the religious groups. So these numbers have gone down. And we'll see, some of the impact of what this actually looks like in a couple of slides. Ultimately, what we see for 2018 is that 56% of the children waiting in foster care are of some minority background, with the remaining 44% being white. But if we look at the statistics for all children awaiting adoption, we see that by identity, 22% are black, 22% are Hispanic, 8% are two or more races or multiracial, 2% American Indian or First Nation, and 0.5% being Asian or Pacific Islander, including Hawaiian. Again, with the changes that the way that the census had its ethnic and racial categorizations, it's hard to put one right next to the other and sort of do it, but there are a couple of slides and a couple of places where I actually am able to do that. The remaining 1% was unknown or unable to determine. I give you all of these numbers, all of these ideas, all of these pieces to talk about how do we go from having 500,000 children who do not have homes and families that are in a system where, again, they may be being taken care of. How do we talk about these sorts of things in comparison to when we talk about international adoption? We talk about this being the greatest country in the world. We talk about how is it possible for us to take these steps sort of forward. We adopt children into this country, domestically and internationally. But we also need to think about those children which we don't talk about, which I get to a little bit at the end, about it going in reverse. As we see these numbers decrease, these number of children that are coming in, as we see the laws that are in place, as we see the policies that are in place, we start to think about where are we? How do we take these positive steps forward as a society that empowers, that strengthens, that gives agency and power to a particular group of individuals and not to others? Now, for any of you in the room who may be a social worker, former social worker, things like this, I'm gonna say partially, this is a talk that we need to have. This may not have been your experience, but this is an experience that we need to talk about. The unspoken hierarchy when it comes to adoption overall. Legally, this does not exist. But in practice, this does occur. I've done over 20 years of research. I've done home visits. I've spoken with a number of individuals, and some individuals don't want to admit that this exists in some way, shape, or form. It's not like I'm, peeking behind a curtain here. But when we think about the idea that when it comes to adoption and foster care, the primary purpose and the primary reason and the primary focus in adoption is always reunification with family if possible. That is the number one goal as a child enters the foster care system or an individual enters the foster care system. We want to reunify them with their families. If that is not possible, then we start to look at some of the alternatives. Immediate family is always and will always be the priority. Whenever possible, a child in out-of-home custody is placed with a member of the immediate family when the biological parent rights have been forfeited. If an appropriate member of the immediate family cannot be found or is unavailable, then the best interest of the child ultimately goes to a same-race couple. So a monoracial or an interracial placement is ultimately sought. If intraracial, again, same race placement is unavailable or not suitable, we try first and foremost, we give biracial placement considered with the first priority given to couples in which the parent of difference or parent of color is the same sex as the child in question. Now, I realize by saying the same sex, I'm using language that may be uncomfortable for some, but again, in the way that we look at it from a governmental standpoint, I'm not making a political statement, but instead using the words of the policies that exist. First priority, again, given to couples which the parent of color is the same sex as the child in question, and then biracial placement with the parent of color being the opposite sex or a different sex other than, and again, I talk about this from a heterosexual standpoint, because as we can see, we go from same sex to biracial couple to opposite or differing race families, so transracial, and then we start to see single, heterosexual, opposite sex individuals, same sex couples, so lesbian couples being preferred over gay male couples, and then identified, at the bottom, the identified same-sex loving or attracted individuals. We're just going to talk about the law. How do you even get to the bottom? Legally, how do you even go? Well, you know, what kind of questions can you ask to get beyond a certain line on that hierarchy? We talk about it in employment practices. We talk about it in a lot of different places that sometimes questions are asked that aren't supposed to be asked, or leading sorts of things, or, you know, searches and all these types of things. So just in the same way that we see it in other scapes and other scopes of life, we see it ultimately within the adoption space. Now, the nice thing to say is that even as you get to the quote-unquote desperate and final-ditch efforts to place special needs or hard-to-place children, often bureaucratic code for children of color and black children within the foster care system, we start to think about other forms of placement which might take it beyond transracial. This hierarchy, fortunately, was much more practiced and prevalent before the enactment of the Multi-Ethnic Placement Act in 1994 and the Inter-Ethnic Placement Amendments in 1996. But the numerous court cases over the past 2 decades since its enactment show that even with stricter legislation trying to soften the usage of this hierarchy, many agencies and practitioners are still using it as a determination of best use and best practice and best interests for the child, even when there are more established opportunities and spaces. The Multi-Ethnic Placement Act had some very simple ideals. It had a set of mandates and it had a set of suggestions. Its set of intentions was to decrease the length of time children wait to be adopted, and we'll see that there was some movement in that direction, to facilitate the recruitment and retention of foster care and adoptive parents who meet the needs of those children that are out there, and ultimately to be able to recruit families into the foster care system that actually represent what's in the system. So in New York State, if there's 13% of the children awaiting adoption that are black, then we need to get closer to 13% of the foster care families that are representative so that there could potentially be selective placement or that type of placement. We want to match as closely as possible the demographics of those children. Again, sort of thinking about how do we want to place these children. That's what this law was trying to do, was trying to get states to go from 1 to 2% of their minoritized or underrepresented parents up to something that was closer to either the national average within the population, or if it's higher, those populations that are ultimately within the system that exists. If you try to eliminate discrimination on race, color, national origin, as we've done and attempted to do in employment, the multi-ethnic and inter-ethnic placement amendments have worked in that sort of direction. The specific mandates, it prohibited states and other entities which received federal funding from denying or delaying placements based upon race, sex, or some protected class. It prohibited states and other entities which, again, received federal funding from denying individuals the opportunity to become adoptive parents and foster care parents. And finally, it did push, as I said before, in order to remain eligible, states must diligently recruit adoptive parents who reflect the racial and ethnic diversity of the children in the state or region who are in need of placement. I think you can all see the loophole in that one. How do you define diligently? Did we try and it didn't work? Well, that's what the courts said. Courts ultimately worked really hard in defiance. Courts allowed race to be one among a number of factors that could be appropriately considered in the placement of a child. If the child's identity and self-esteem was seen as being very important to the well-being of the specific child. And that was coming from the Donaldson Institute, the preeminent adoptive group in the country. We saw that the University of Missouri, Kansas City Law School said blanket policies, again, favoring same-race placements, have been disfavored, but in individual cases, they're allowed to do whatever they want. That makes sense in that case. Take the case as it comes. We think that this will work in this case, but it's not going to work in this other case. If a social worker comes forward and says, you know what, race is really important to the development of this child, but not to their twin, not to their sibling. This sibling seems to have more issues. The placement of one child, the children could be split up, the children could be separated, the children could be placed differentially on different criteria. Instead of looking at ultimately what's in the best interest of the child. Is the best interest of the child to keep them with their sibling? Is it to separate them? How do we take these steps, ultimately being able to move forward? To enforce the policies or attempt to give them teeth, we saw these mandates. But again, it's all about federal funding. These are just states. So what you saw before with those numbers is you saw that those numbers began to decrease. You saw fewer white children, you saw fewer black children, you saw fewer children ultimately in the system as they started to move into the private agencies. They started to move into other spaces. To illustrate that, the impact of the MEPA and IEP on time in foster care. In 1998, the mean was 22 months. That's how long a child on average spent in the foster care system, with a median around 11.2. In 2018, the mean time went down to 19.2 months, but the median increased. What's hidden in these numbers is that black children tended to be in foster care and in the protective system 6 to 8 months longer than their same cohort, non-minoritized, non-specific individuals. So what you started to see was it was having an impact on the placement for white children, for Asian children, for biracial and multiracial children. So colorism started to come into it. But it also varied by region. It varied by time. At its bottom space, the one thing that is most predictive of success when it comes to adoption is age of placement. When it comes to behavioral outcomes, the longer a child, regardless of their race, regardless of pre-adoptive insults and abuse, the longer that you are in foster care, the longer that you're in the adoptive system, the more likely you are to have behavioral issues. International, domestic, across the board. So we're already continuing a process which is hurting a certain segment of those children that are available to be adopted. If we look at it actually on race-based adoption, I highlighted, because of the difference, I highlighted Hispanic because in 1998 you see, American Indian and Alaskan Native, Asian non-Hispanic, Asian Pacific Islander non-Hispanic, Hawaiian non-Hispanic, black non-Hispanic, white non-Hispanic, on down. And then I tried to match them as closely as possible next to each other in these spaces that, again, the number of black children adopted in 1998 was 15,909, and in 2018, it was 10,795. When we look at Hispanic, it was 4,652 to 13,327 because it was Hispanic of any race. Because you can be black and Hispanic, white and Hispanic, Asian and Hispanic, American Indian, you can, anything. It's a concomitant ethnicity as the census reads it. So we see increases and changes in the numbers. But ultimately, we look at even those white individuals. 13,617, 30,924. They tried to get rid of the double counting, but they said there's still double counting. There's still these issues. There's a lot less black children in the system, at least in the state systems, in the federal system. A lot of them have moved into private agencies, have moved into religious-related organizations, and those types of spaces. The bright side is that when you look at empirical studies of transracial adoption, the research ultimately suggests that transracial adoption is actually viable. It provides stable homes for waiting children. The reported adoption rates and disruption rates at 10 to 15% for transracial adoptions, and specifically black adoptions, are not significantly higher than those for other adoptions, as it says up there. So those arguments to say, well, a black family is what a black child needs, they're not going to function well. They're not going to be able to do anything. They're not going to be able to be successful. The numbers don't bear that out. Now, I even point to that to say it's 2006, midpoint after the MEP and IEP came into place. Even in those cases, race has become a significant issue across the board. As we talk about race, as we talk about transracial adoption, as we talk about the multitude of social movements and such, we look at all of the studies that indicate transracially adopted, adolescents and younger children actually do, as it says in the second point, actually do and can be successful. But the policies that are in place, the opportunities to be able to put a stance in place, to be able to put policies in place which are subsidies and guardianship, pre-adoptive classes, opportunities to actually make sure that the families succeed, have been a hallmark of what positive the Multi-Ethnic Placement Act and the Inter-Ethnic Placement Act have put into place. There is nothing that has been shown by my colleagues or even myself in the study that we did in 1995 that shows that transracial adoption is actually detrimental for the adoptee on a consistent basis. There are individual cases. You can watch the Today Show. You can watch any of the things that are on YouTube that say, I'm broken. I'm in this space. I have not understood this. I've had this heartbreak. I've had all these things going on. They're real. They're valid. They're real. They're things which occur. But by and large, when you look at the systems, there is nothing to significantly and consistently support higher disruption rates. More often a break in the relationship or those types of things. So we look at race and cultural socialization. Racial socialization and cultural socialization are two things that we're always looking at. Race socialization is just treating and teaching pride in one's racial background. Cultural socialization as that promotion focus, exposing and developing appreciation for your own cultural practices and the history of your ethnic group. These are at the center of the arguments that we see for adoption. Lisa Chen and Diane Hughes put together a group of measures that sort of put these sorts of things together. In race socialization, it's ideas like, I've talked to my child about experience and expectations others might have of blacks' abilities. I've told my child that black kids must be better than white kids to get the same rewards. So again, it's that preparation for race socialization versus the cultural socialization. I've talked about racial stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination against. I've taken my child to see ethnic hair, to get ethnic hairstyles, to have clothing and things like that. We see a lot more of this use in international adoption, but it's still in that sort of space. All the issues that we talk about, whether it be isolation, depression, abandonment, we have to have a desire to identify ourselves, identify our families, and to deal with some of the issues that are there. But again, the research there says that proper and strong growth, proper and strong training gives us the opportunity to put our parents and put ourselves in the best possible space. So today, We see small increases in transracial adoptions of black children from foster care, moving from 17% up to 22% in 2015. We've seen the basis of the MEP enforcing, running counter to best practices in adoption, and ultimately enforcement to recruit families, to recruit families has gotten us into a better place. We've seen that potential parents for adoption for black children, we're seeing communities that are most likely to adopt them, we're dealing with those issues. We're doing training beforehand. We're making sure that these children have opportunities. We're making sure that all children have opportunities in the same way that we do in the job market, that we make sure that we do it in the educational spaces to the degree that it's possible. But again, that's only the state. Private agencies have a lot more resources to be able to do this and a lot more freedom to be able to place themselves in the best possible space. We've gone across recommendations and things like that, but I want to leave you with actually one sort of final idea of why black children need loving homes, why a conversation on transracial adoption needs to occur. Because never getting adopted has been shown to have a negative impact on children. Depending on the state, once you leave the foster care or the adoptive system at either 18 or 21, you see that 27% of males and 10% of females were incarcerated within a year and a half after they aged out of the system. 50% were unemployed. A third had not finished high school. A third were receiving public assistance. A fifth of females had given birth to children. But it's that last point that we should think about from a societal standpoint. Before leaving care, 47% of those children were receiving some kind of counseling or medication for mental health problems. That number drops to 21% after leaving. We're not placing success at the front end. And this has been used as the front end argument for adoption, for the placement and for the ways in which we sort of think about sort of where we go. But there is hope. There is positivity, and there's a lot of places that are in there. We continue to lobby, we continue to do the work to actually improve the stakes of all of our children, not just merely our black children, make sure that the homes that they go into are in that space, but also come together as a community. If we're able to do that, we see significant amounts of success, and we see the best possible outcomes. That is what I want to leave you with. And that's the bright point of where I think we're going to go ultimately when it comes to this. Thank you.